It was a casual afternoon when students were returning to their homes from school. A sudden procession of special military-grade vehicles moving on the road, with quite special students in tow. The vehicles were branded with the symbol of Warrior High. A few years back, terrifying events occur out of nowhere. Gates and portals opened across the vivid sky, with monsters flowing out, terrorizing the world. Later on, it was scientifically concluded that a planet similar to Earth existed far away across the universe. The certain planet had mysteriously exploded, and the remnants flew towards Earth. Parts of both the planets started to fuse. It was termed as adhesion phenomena. That was how the unusual and monstrous flora and fauna were introduced on Earth. It affected 17% of the entire planet. As the monsters raged, humans started to lose control over the lands, and the dangerous territories were eventually termed dungeons. The unknown monsters were strong, unlike the humans who weren't prepared for such a sudden scenario. But they were fortunate. The other world had brought not just disasters alongside it. The limitations the humans of Earth had previously also shattered. They acquired tremendous powers to deal with the monsters they faced. Although the situation affected every human equally, the powers they awakened was variable individual to individual. The chosen humans started to train their body and skills with a sole reason: to regain their control over what was theirs. These certain humans were called adventurers. That was how the Age of Dungeons and Adventures began. When both clashed and humans emerged victorious, the entire world acknowledged their accomplishments and were inspired by them. Soon enough, centers and organizations engaging in training adventurers emerged. And amongst them, the best institution in the Republic of Korea, which had managed to produce the best adventurers for the past 25 years, was the world-renowned Warrior High School. While the returning students were discussing the school, girls shout and scream at the sight of a half-elf, Daev Choi. He was a first-year student at Warrior High who had survived a dungeon 14 times. His father was a famous adventurer himself and mother, an elf. He apparently was a genius and future top ranker. While the two friends argue it out, deciding their next destination, they ask their third friend, Jaryong, if he was yet again off to work. He apologizes while looking at his phone screen. It was a notification to pay the hospital bills that were due. One of the guys complains, while the other punches him, saying that it was understandable. When he goes off, he asks his friend to be more sensitive and reasonable. On his way back, a notification from a certain person named Chief appears on his screen, notifying he had work and asking him to come over. He walks into a rundown subway, where the apparent Chief, Jae-hwan, shows him of the client of the day. At the sight of a student, the client shouts at Jae-hwan, demanding answers since he asked for the best, but a kid had showed up, feeling he was being scammed. Jaryong mockingly calls for the bodyguard the client had brought alongside him as if a former adventurer. At his rude remarks, the client starts screaming yet again, but the bodyguard adventurer hushes him, decisive to beat Jaryong up and break a limb or two. He was Lee Pilgyu, a former silver-ranked adventurer who had survived dungeons 81 times, before retiring. Silver ranks were offered to individuals who had records of surviving dungeons for over 50 times. Jaryong, now hyped, lets loose. He exclaims at how he was unable to ask forgiveness. He was a first-year student who had survived dungeon raids 371 times, although illegally. He was a dungeon smuggler. While adventurers worked hard every day, before their exit, associations were to inspect the loot they acquired. Since the circulation of something unknown and powerful would endanger lives, As such, the treasures and items are first inspected and then taxed. But there always exist individuals who break norms. The dungeon smugglers were people who would pocket such treasures and loot illegally, causing a loss to the society as a whole. The client shouts at Jae-hwan asking if he wanted to continue since Pilgyu had a sore temper and had previously killed one of his teammates. Jae-hwan asks him not to be scared, but he argues saying the kid would really die. Pilgyu reasons saying he was being dragged down by the apparent teammate and had hence trashed him. Jaryong, now certain that such an act might have forced his retirement, but is cut off in his words by Pilgyu's rapid punch. Jaryong dodges agilely. Pilgyu punches yet again, which he blocks and decides to return him a light kick, straight at his face. Jae-hwan asks the client to witness the best he had asked for himself. Jaryong is a bit disappointed since he expected a retired adventurer to put up a decent fight. Lee Pilgyu was astonished. He had thought of the smuggling team before him as a mere child. But the reflexes Jaryong displayed were well qualified as a pro. He rips apart his shirt and screams decisive to beat him down. Adventurers took training to hone their awakened abilities. Pilgyu's abilities were sorted around body strengthening, which was why he was a tank, a position where one takes incoming damages to shield their party members. Tanks would train their physical bodies that could best monsters and even bullets, and top-tier tanks could even take missiles head-on. They were, in other words, a shield. Pilgyu uses two of his skills: Iron Skin and Giant Strength. A green aura now enveloping him. This was a real adventurer. He pummels the ground with his fists, blasting Jaryong away. Jae-hwan exclaims at his crude behavior. Jaryong focuses on Pilgyu, who punches at his face but hits the wall behind. He asks why Jaryong was suddenly being so distant. Jae-hwan analyzes that Pilgyu was almost at the level of a decent truck, capable of pulverizing someone on hit. He asks Jaryong to quickly wrap it up, warning that any delay would dock his pay. Pilgyu closes in saying Jae-hwan wasn't aware of the ongoings and reminds Jaryong that none of his previous cheap tricks would work since he now was fighting as a pro tanker. Jaryong picks up a nearby steel rod and judges it to be good enough. While Pilgyu was charging at him with full force, Jaryong picks up his steel rod. Jae-hwan says that it was now over. While tanks might appear as unbeatable beings, they had one fatal weakness: a natural enemy. A certain someone who could focus a powerful and devastating force in a single point. For example, a damage dealer. As the two close in on each other, Jaryong swings the rod in his hand, in one fluid motion, knocking Pilgyu out instantly. The broken Pilgyu asks of where he had managed to learn that particular move. Jaryong decides it might as well be probable since he might have seen his father. When Jaryong was a little kid, his father was the greatest adventurer to him. It wasn't solely because he was his father. His name was Yoo Jaryong, one of the first-generation heroes. Although it was now a legendary tale, but back then, it was hellish. The biggest drawback was the lack of information. There were no answers to what dungeons were or what monsters lay deep within them. The monsters well known now were the greatest calamities back then. At that day and age, there weren't neither enough skills nor items to utilize. In such dire conditions, the first-generation adventurers had to rely on the method or trial and error, while risking life and limb. The survivors passed on their experience and accomplishments to the next generations. These adventurers were known as heroes. Yoo Jaryong was a dragon slayer, a nickname given after he had defeated a dragon and stood proudly as Asia's top ranker. He also was Jaryong's father. He respected and admired him the most, while watching him practice in awe during his younger years. He believed he was invincible, but he was suffering. He watched his father fall, with teary eyes. The cause being poison. He had come across some lethal poison during one of his previous explorations. Like every prior ordeal, he tried to overcome it. But after decades of futile efforts, his body was at its limits. The colleagues whom his father had trusted and took advantage of his vulnerability and stole his fortunes and deeds. He suffered mentally and physically for countless years. Years later, when the world was forgetting of Yoo Jaryong the Dragon Slayer, his father had lost his identity as a hero after losing his everything. All that remained was an unknown legacy. While Jaryong walks away, Jae-hwan informs the client that the pay he was to pay was doubled since he had provoked them previously. Jae-hwan asks Jaryong if he knew of the Imperial Wasp. He spits out the water he was drinking in shock and disbelief, inquiring if he had to fight it. It was a monster whose danger gradient was of the highest in the entire world. The place Uedo, where it had made its nest, became Korea's most difficult demon realm. Jae-won reports that the government had organized an unpublicized raid, consisting of all of the country's top rankers. Although they had failed in their motive of eradication, they had successfully killed the queen bee. One of the top hunters had smuggled the royal jelly of the bees through his subordinates. Jaryong is startled of why a top ranker would smuggle some insignificant nutritional